Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Jesuits of Canada, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our session. If I understood synodality, would I have this look on my face? Thank you for joining us tonight. Before we begin, I will give a few instructions so that those who prefer French can listen to the session in that language. Alors, pour choisir la langue de votre préférence, si vous êtes sur un ordinateur, dans les commandes de votre réunion ou webinaire, cliquez sur le bouton Interprétation et après cliquez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Si vous êtes sur un appareil mobile, dans le contrôle de votre réunion, appuyez sur le bouton avec les trois petits points au plus et après appuyez sur le bouton Interprétation de la langue, l'option Interprétation de la langue. Finalement, appuyez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. C'est important de se souvenir que l'interprétation linguistique n'est pas disponible lorsque vous accédez à Zoom sur un navigateur web. Let us begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let us take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which many of us call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. In Canada, from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and commit, each in our own way, to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Now, there are a few housekeeping items to address before we get started. First, the session will be approximately 60 minutes. This will include a presentation and time for asking questions. And to ask questions, please, after the presentation, you can either enter them in the Q&A box to the Q&A button or raise your hand to ask them out loud. If you enter them in the chat box, they might be missed, so please pay attention to those two options. Raise your hand or use the Q&A button, and then you can either ask them out loud or we can read them. The recordings of the sessions finally will be sent to those who registered within 3 business days after today. So watch out for that. They will send by email. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Curtis McKenzie. Curtis is a Jesuit theologian with a unique perspective. Welcome, Curtis. And his vision, his perspective is shaped by his journey from the corporate finance world to the spirituality of the Jesuits. He's a deacon of the Ukrainian Catholic Church and is soon to be ordained to the priesthood, and is currently working on his Ph.D. at Fordham University in New York. Welcome, Curtis.
Thank you, Jose.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk with you this evening about synodality, and I apologize to begin with that I can't see everybody. I know there's a number of people that have joined, but I'm hoping over the next half hour or so that I can unpack a little bit about what I've written on synodality and what I hope might be helpful for you as you ask the same questions I have, which is what is synodality? Or as I've titled this, if I understood synodality, would I have this look on my face? Now, just to set the context briefly, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions, which I'll do my best to answer, or depending on what comes forward, we can arrange to have somebody get back to you. Aussi, j'ai compris qu'il y a des personnes en ligne qui, le premier langue c'est français. Si vous avez des questions en français, j'essaierai le mieux possible de vous répondre. Bon, so with all of that, let us begin. I want to start by saying this isn't a 2-semester course on synodality, and there's a lot, quite frankly, to talk about as it pertains to synodality. Some of it is just even how did it begin? What did it look like in the first 7 or 8 centuries of Christianity when there was still an understanding of an ecumenical church? What happened after it divided? How did that vary in Greek Orthodoxy and in other Slavic countries? how did that evolve in the Roman Catholic Church, what really took place at Vatican II as it pertains to synodality, and then what exactly is the Pope hoping we would accomplish today. And these things are very important. They really are. But I'm going to focus on just one dimension of synodality for tonight, something that I believe, in the research I've been doing on this for some time, is kind of an underlying necessity, if you will, and for which I found rather humorously and interestingly that Alan Alda, of all people, had something to say on the exact same point 4 or 5 years ago in a book he wrote about communication. For those of you who don't know who Alan Alda is, he was an actor who became very famous with a TV show called MASH and a series of films that followed afterwards. But he actually grew up in the Bronx, just down the road from Fordham, and got his liberal arts degree at Fordham under the auspices of the Jesuits, and perhaps like Denzel Washington, who's also a Fordham graduate in the acting program, has gone on to do very interesting work. And I think because of that, understand just how difficult it can be to communicate complex ideas, foster understanding, and build stronger relationships. So let's start with this question: why synodality? And to give an initial answer, I want to borrow a story from Mark Carney. He wrote a book not too long ago called Values, where he draws on some comments made by Pope Francis during a lunch that occurred 9 years ago. It was a lunch that I attended along with Dr. Carney and some other people. And it went like this. In July of 2014, representatives of the church, policymakers, business people, academics, labor leaders, charity workers, and even a Nobel Prize winner gathered at the Vatican over 2 days to discuss the global common good. The lunchtime keynote was by Pope Francis. And in his talk, what he said to us was that anthropological reductionism is what happens to man, that is, each person, as happens when wine becomes grappa. It passes through an organizational still. It's no longer wine, it becomes something else, perhaps more useful, more specialized, but it's not wine. Our meal will be accompanied by wine, but at the end of lunch, we'll have grappa. And grappa is one thing: alcohol. Grappa is wine distilled. Now, the Pope's point was that while humanity is many things, we're passionate, curious, rational, altruistic, creative, self-interested. The logic of what he called the market, which he views as the biggest enemy of the common good, is really only one thing. It's self-interest. It's humanity distilled. And so the Pope turned to us, and his challenge to the room was, your job as business people is to turn grappa back into wine, to turn the market back into humanity. And so it was less about theology than a check on reality. Now, this is the case with synodality. To my reading, if you wanted kind of a buzzword for it, what Francis is proposing is to energize or re-energize synodality, because he's focused on one thing, and that is turning the church from grappa back into wine by turning the self-interest or vices of clericalism and anthropocentrism into synodality. Now, I'm not making a theological statement with this. This is just a turn of phrase. That is to say that Francis as Pope has really been characterized, I think, by repeating two very common narratives. One has been going to the margins, or sometimes he calls them the peripheries. And the second is leaving behind a structure for dialogue that helps people live their life and live it to the max. So what exactly is synodality then, and quite frankly, why should you care about it? In a nutshell, synodality means dialogue. If you want one word for it, it's dialogue. Or if you prefer a different word for it, you could use communication. What it literally means, synodos, means to go together, to travel on the same route. And it's not going together as in going on a silent retreat, but to go together for the purposes of being in dialogue and to communicate. And communicating ideas is one of the primary challenges that the synodal process hopes to do for the church. In other words, it's about giving space so that clarity can emerge in an otherwise and often confusing landscapes. As I wrote in my article quoting Alan Alda, he says, people are dying because we can't communicate in ways that allow us to understand one another. And I think in the case of synodality, its hope is to try to look at these challenges and recognize that communication is necessary to disentangle complicated religious ideas, particularly those that are still searching for clear definitions to explain what the church calls its broad kerygma, or another way to say that is what the gospel proclaims and invites us to ponder, contemplate, and live. In this way, synodality is not a new language or a buzzword, but rather a hope to resolving this disengagement. And to explain what I mean by that, disengagement is really being separated from the person we hope will understand us. It's one of the most difficult things that we can ask for in the church, and that is for people to stick around to understand complex concepts and ideas. In other words, it's important to understand, I believe, why people tune out, or in congregational terms, why they leave the church. In business settings, we sometimes will say it's like watching both your customers and your employees head for the door until the only person left is the manager. Now, whether those people are business people, or they're clerics or priests or religious, or what the church calls the laity, those individuals who quite frankly make up the common priesthood of all of God's people, really doesn't matter. As Alda puts it in his book, we tend to miss that the fundamental ingredient of communication is empathy. And as Alda defined it, empathy is learning to recognize what the other person is thinking and feeling, which quite frankly is more than the ability to listen. It's knowing how to react in a way that we open up to the other person. In other words, we have to tune in to them, to engage with them in sort of a dance of ideas, and that it might take us actually in some unknown directions. In a very basic way, this empathy is sort of a key part of synodality, and really how we can understand what it means to go together. And I think this is the key thing that the Pope stresses over and over as it pertains to synodality, this hope for togetherness. He keeps inviting the deal makers in the church to journey together and to change or evolve or reconsider together. Now, in North America and Western Europe in particular, those aspects of change or discussion, if you will, how might we go together, are currently focused, I think, around three fairly big topics, and they have been big topics for several years. One is how to expand the role of women in the church. The other is to review the historic priesthood and episcopacy. And I think for many, it's also getting clarity about persons who identify as LGBTQIA. Another way to say that is that participation and inclusivity are probably the most important fault lines currently in the church. And I think to leave those things unaddressed as we move through synodality will risk dividing people. That is, you can't really go with people together. That is, we can't have the synodos if we're divided in some way from the outset. Now, I say that, but want to clarify that synodality is not doctrine. Rather, what synodality hopes to address is the pathology of communicative illness. Another way of saying that is that we generally assume that we know more than the other person. There's a Jungian analyst named James Hollis who once wrote, "All generations are seduced into anthropocentrism." we tend to defend our vision of the world as superior to that of others. Now, part of our contemporary reality is that we live in a culture that has discarded the mythical roadmaps. And these are maps that once helped us to locate who we are in a larger context. According to Hollis, because we no longer have these tribal visions of gods and spiritual networks, individuals are cut adrift and wander, often without guidance or models or help through the various stages of life. Now, I believe that Synodality hopes to fix this, at least in some way, and at least for the Catholic Church. At the heart is really a basic idea of what the Pope calls synodal listening, that we should pay more attention to what other people say rather than to our own assumptions. If we pay attention only to our assumptions, what we're really practicing is not synodal listening, but what he would call disconnected listening. So to steal from Alda again, in our mind, we tell ourselves we're relating, but in truth, we're often kind of leaning over and waiting for the other person to finish talking. Now, I think it would be a mistake to think then that this is just sort of window dressing, or that synodality is kind of the icing the Pope puts to put on the cake. And it quite frankly, it isn't. This is the cake. This is the main thing. It's this dialogical understanding that's the basic idea implanted in synodality, or as Alda put it when he reflected on his time of doing improv, it's the practice of being so aware of the other person that even if you have your back to them, you're observing them. As Alda wrote, this kind of relating is letting everything seep into you in such a way that it has an effect on how you respond to the other person. Now, I think a really good question is, well, how much of that is make-believe versus real life? It sounds nice, but does it in fact work? Well, the thing is, synods and synodality are not new ideas. These have been around for 2,000 years. Whether it's always worked well or not, it's nothing new. And if the starting point for synodality is merely just talk, then, well, will anything actually change, or will anything happen as they say? My contention is that synodality engages real life, not make-believe. Now, Alda, he's kind of got a funny way of saying this, but I think it's very true. He says there's a difference between planning how to behave, which is acting, from finding our relationship in another person's eyes, which is life. Now, it's a very true thing. At its core, synodality is responding to another person, and so is our interaction with somebody else. In fact, synodality insinuates that we're willing to be changed by the other person. Alda says it this way: if I do listen openly, naively, and innocently, there's a chance, possibly the only chance, the true dialogue and real communication will take place between us. And when this happens, things like listening circles no longer become interviews, but instead transform into conversations. They're places where we should really try to come in armed as much as possible with both a curiosity and a little bit of a natural ignorance, because it spurs on a kind of listening that's contagious. And this genuine curiosity, I believe, positions us to want to understand the other person, including their work, their life, what they believe, what they're worried about. And it really steers us clear from the perils and the formality and jargon that tends to break things down and pull us out of relating. That is, if we can stop the cryptic lingo that breaks human bonds almost immediately, then we're getting much closer to synodality. Now, hopefully this is clear. Communication does not take place because we tell somebody something. That's at least what I was told as a child growing up. Communication takes place when we observe the other person. That is, we track their ability to follow what we are sharing. This is because synodality, which again, as I've shared, is in a word, it's dialogue or it's communication, is really a group experience. We have to be comfortable with another person's presence and relate in personal ways. So in my view, there is no synodality if there's no communication. And with that, that also means that listening to good communication is not enough. We have to be open to some training of how to communicate and to how to be synodal. Alda uses this joke: I've been listening to good pianists all my life and I still can't play the piano. Well, I think that's true even for people who have looked at synodality for years. We can read as much as we want about it, but to some degree, this is a new experience of how to be in dialogue and communicate with synodality together. Maybe another funny way to put it is, at the outset, it might feel a bit like a charming argument between two horses who are tethered to each other, pulling in different directions, but resenting each other's influence. And I think this is very true in so many ways and facets of life, that the heart and the mind often struggle to work together to resolve conflicts. It's sort of what we want is a peace treaty with sort of the emotional side or the heart, and at the same time with our reason, which we might call the mind, where neither side is allowed to win or lose. And synodality really invites both of these things to come together, our feelings and how we think, in a way that avoids antagonism. And that's not just at the individual level, but as I've stressed, across the entire group. And that means we have to be willing to accept that we're going to be involved in some kind of very messy collaboration. As Alda put it in his book, we have to be open to the possibility that the experience may very well emerge with the conclusion that neither side is right. We could discover another mechanism that no one had thought of yet. In fact, some years ago when I worked in Rome, there was a priest there that gave me some very good advice. He said, your good intention and my good intention don't always result in a third good intention. Or to speak of it in synodal terms, what you bring to the table and what I bring to the table may result in something completely different than what either of us had intended. This is my way of saying synodality opens the possibility for a third way. And that's only true, though, if we see synodality as a dialogical model of communication, that it is both a means and an end. In other words, it's the means of dialogue in the church that begins with God and the role of Jesus. This in particular being how to praise, reverence, and serve. And in return for that, God helps to bring us to salvation. And so in this sense, synodality is a means towards an interim end in this life, and it will evolve from time to time. Sometimes we'll be happy with how that advances, and sometimes not. It's a bit like Alan Alda's idea of the difference between practicing the piano and becoming a pianist. Practice is the means, but it's not the end. But I would also say listening during practice means we hear music, not just noise. And so the synodality that we experience now as a means also brings us into relationship for the end, which is our relationship with God. I think it also tells us that we're open for business. My personal prayer is that synodality will be what the people of God hope it might be. To steal from St. Ignatius, one of the founders of the Society of Jesus, he might even say to us, are we asking whether synodality can be the next introduction to making a choice for a good way of life in the church? And I think we'll have to wait and see on that. But even if it's not for the whole church, even if somehow this struggles a little bit, I do think synodality will be very helpful for the people hovering at the front door, the people that are standing there and wondering whether they should stay or whether they should leave. Now, my answer to them, if I was standing there with them, I'd say, come on in. What synodality will tell us is that it's a mess in here, and we're like a bunch of tethered horses trying to figure it out. But I do believe we will figure it out. So with that, I'd like to thank you for hearing what I have to say about synodality and this particular interpretation. And since it's a Tuesday evening, while we even finish a few minutes early from what I was going to say, which will hopefully give us a bit more time for questions. So thank you again, and I will turn it back to Jose.
Thank you, Curtis, for such an enlightening presentation. It really shed some light on the concept of synodality and what we're trying to do as church and as people. We now have time for some questions. If you haven't entered them, remember you can enter them through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen or at the top, depending on the device that you're using, or by raising your hand if you'd like to ask out loud. And we'll try to answer them time permitting towards until the end of the session, until the end of our time together. We already have a few questions that we could read out loud. So first question, Curtis, with the upcoming synod on synodality generating so much discussion, what are your thoughts on the potential for evolving doctrinal perspectives? I think your presentation already shed some light on that, but including topics like women's ordination and others.
Yeah, I'm not in a position to be able to say what will or will not come out of it. I think maybe the way to answer this question is to try to distinguish synodality from doctrine in this way. Synodality is about putting people together so that they can speak with each other and hear what the other person has to say, and to work at that communication, and then to receive that communication. And that by itself is a very challenging thing to do. And what the Pope wants to do is to put that dialogical mechanism in place. What then comes out of that is discussion about doctrine as a second step. And by the way, this is, again, I will stress this is not a new thing. Doctrine in the church, if we read through the history of the Catholic Church, has evolved over the centuries. It's in fact, it's evolved quite a bit. And so I believe what the Pope hopes to accomplish is that in looking at the way synodality resolves some of the biggest controversies in the early days of the church, that can also work today around things that are important to people in terms of doctrinal questions. But what might change and when that might change and how that might change, that's really for a synod of people to gather and to discern together. That's not something I personally know the answer to. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Curtis. Another question. If I understand your message, are you telling us that after all of this process, we may come out with nothing to move forward on?
I don't know the answer to that. So I'm a theological researcher, not a divine predictor. I don't know what the future will bring. Historically speaking, there are intervals in the church when these questions are brought forward, and there's certainly lots of evidence in the articles that are coming out daily, weekly, monthly, that the questions, particularly some of them that I've alluded to, are on the Pope's mind, as are others. And whether that will happen in concert with the Synod on Synodality, or whether that will happen subsequently or in a different way, I don't know for sure. But I think, again, I would stress that the first step is really to establish this dialogical, communicative model of being able to speak and to be heard. And that by itself is a big advancement. And as that continues to get better, then things like questions around doctrine and praxis can come into that space and be discerned together, as opposed to individually by, say, just a group of bishops or or a pope on his own.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, and we'll try to continue answering questions in the order that they come in. The next one that we received is from Pamela. There was a comment for listening circles to be a more curious place. In our initial experiences with synodality, where listening circles were used to listen and hear what people/parishioners thought and felt about the church and direction of the church. When do you transition to a listening circle that becomes more conversational? Would there, sorry, this is a repetition of words. Would there be a fear that people would judge or shut down a different viewpoint? Or do you need very good facilitators and training?
I mean, that's a fantastic question. From my previous life in business, one of the real risks of getting people together to talk is exactly what Pamela is speaking to, that a dominant perspective emerges, and then that dominant perspective gets ratified in a phenomenon known as groupthink. That is, we all sort of start to agree with what was previously said rather than challenge the status quo. Now, what synodality aims to do, and this is very important, is to give equal voice. And in that sense, even if somebody has a very firm interpretation of let's say an existing matter or how they would like to see it changed, the weight of that voice does not carry any more than anybody else's. And so I think Pamela is right in saying you do want to have people that are there that can facilitate that kind of conversation. And this goes back to my about halfway through, where I spoke to good communication is not enough. We also need to learn how to be good communicators and how to participate in good communication. It's a practice for us too. I think, to steal a different analogy, we could study swimming as much as we wanted to, but at some point we had to jump in the pool and recognize that it takes time to become a very proficient swimmer. And so this is the same thing with synodality, for all of the church to get engaged in it, not just bishops, but bishops, priests, people that belong to religious communities. Most importantly, the people that come to church on Sunday, the mothers and the fathers and the kids and the grandmothers and everybody who's walking through, they're part of this conversation somehow. And even if they're not immediately in the room, their views have to be brought forward. So I think, the risk is to not give people equal voice. Synodality, I believe, as it moves forward, will clarify this equality of voice and participation. But thank you for that question.
Thank you. So now we can probably take a live question. Cora, if you're ready to ask a question, I will invite you to unmute.
Yes. Good evening. I'm from Toronto.
Evening.
Yeah, I am just, in the sense, an orderly manner of having this conversation. Is there any like sequencing or what topic should be discussed? Like, for example, management of the parish by the pastor, and then the involvement of the LGBT community, and then liturgical participation of the laity. Is there any kind of order that you have to suggest on this? Because if it's a conversation, it can go in so many aspects, no?
Thank you first, Cora. Let me thank you for your question. I understand that, for me too, I would like to know with better clarity what kind of things we should be talking about. It's easier to identify something and talk about that. But I want to stress that at least in terms of what I'm speaking about this evening, where my presentation resides, is first and foremost just a better communicating and being in dialogue with each other. So for example, if we had a meeting on a specific subject, in a way, the temptation is to try to find an answer to that question immediately. Where, what do we think should happen in the parish? It could be even as something in Toronto, for example, if you go to the Jesuit parish there, Our Lady of Lourdes, they have candles that you can burn in the corner. You can light a candle, but there's other parishes where that runs on electricity for fire code reasons. Well, you could have a meeting about that, and some kind of discussion could emerge. But the initial point is not to say, well, should they be real candles or electric candles, but rather, are we able to get together and communicate and dialogue with each other? The second thing is then to have a good communication about the things that matter to that parish. And there are lots of examples of local synodality, things that happen in a parish environment, and regional synods that happen at various conferences and so forth and so on. And those are in fact quite frequent in Eastern Catholic churches and Greek Orthodox churches. They've been less part of the tradition in the Roman Catholic Church. The synod has tended to happen more amongst bishops at episcopal conferences. And so part of why I'm speaking of this other side is that the Pope is wanting to sort of rebalance this so that people at the local level will have the same type of communication models and mechanisms that they can have, let's say, in Rome. And then what gets on that agenda is really for the group to determine. So what would be on the agenda for your community, I don't know specifically, but I would say most importantly would be just a willingness to get together and to speak with each other and to listen to each other. I hope that answers your question, Cora.
Thank you. But is there a purpose or objective? Did the Pope specify what he wants to achieve in this?
At this particular moment, the only thing he's been very clear about is wanting to restore synodality in the church. And right now, in fact, in the next 30 days, there'll be the next phase of the Synod on Synodality to evolve. Hopefully further specifics about what that means. At the moment, it's been focused mostly on dialogue and communication and going together and acknowledging the various viewpoints that people have. But there has not been sort of a document that's come out just yet that says more specifically, here's what we're going to look at. That's the next step that will occur in Rome in the coming days and weeks.
Thank you, Cora. We have another question, this time from the Q&A button. I guess one could suggest that synodality is not about who is right or wrong, but that we journey together. We can find some commonality and respect the differences, and yet move to a place where we are all listening or communicating together, bettering ourselves and our communities. Or is that too simplistic / pie in the sky vision?
No, it's not too simplistic, and it's not pie in the sky. I live in a Jesuit community at the moment that's made up of 70 other Jesuits. And this should come as no surprise that Jesuits, after all of their education, have different viewpoints. As the old joke goes, if you ask 4 Jesuits for the answer to a question, you're likely to get 5 opinions. And we ourselves are very diligent in getting together at least every other week to simply speak with each other in a way that we practice our own communication. And the way that we do that often, so that it's not, let's say, an argument over a particular perspective, is we might share with each other our vocation story. How is it that we became a Jesuit? We might share an experience we've had most recently in our ministry. Where have we seen God's grace work? We might also speak about places where we've seen suffering or challenges, and that we would like to go and do more, be more broadly available to help a community in need. In my own case, as a member of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, both in Canada and the United States, there have been hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians that have come following the war in search of support. And there's a lot of communication that we do around that. So it's not always just about, well, what is the conclusion of one thing or another, but in fact, often things outside of ourselves. And I would say it's not pie in the sky. There's many things that we can talk about and share with each other in our local church, including who we are, where we come from, why we're there, why we believe in God, what stands in the way of that belief. And I think there's an incredible richness of people in the parish, and just getting together with each other is a great start.
Now we've got a bit of a simpler question. How long will the synod, I'm assuming synod and synodality, how long will it last and how will it unfold?
I wish I knew the answer. I personally wish I knew the answer to that question as well. At the outset, the idea was that the synod on synodality would span between 2 and 3 years, and that as an outcome to that, there would be, I presume, I don't know this, but a document of some type will be prepared that will pull it all together. In the meantime, there are, of course, various things that the church releases to talk about how it is advancing. And how it will unfold is also, I think, something still up for consideration, in the sense that various people have been invited into those conversations at different stages. For example, here in the United States, there were several parishes and dioceses that participated in initial conversations that provided input to the U.S. Bishops' Conference. That then went forward to Rome. There have also been meetings where theologians who are experts in this particular field have been able to gather and provide advice on how synodality works. And I think, a bit like any significant attempt, there are multiple groups of people interacting in various ways that are collaborating and communicating. And so part of it for us is we watch, but we also too contribute through our own presence in the parish and our own discussions with each other, and even webinars like this. I'm fortunate that one of the individuals who has been asked to do some contribution on the Synod of Synodality is at the same place that I'm at. And so for example, these are questions that you're asking are questions that we also discuss, and that does have a way of filtering up, even if not always in the most strictest formal sense.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Jeanette. Don't you think that the first thing to do in the church would be to review priestly training to introduce the dimension of synodality in particular?
Yes. Now I see that Jeanette has asked that question in French. Would you prefer that I responded in French or in English?
I think either would work.
Okay, I'll do a little bit. I'll do a little bit of both. And
I'm sorry beforehand. French is not my mother's language. It'll be a challenge for me, but I completely agree with your question. It's a question to find out where synodality occurs. Well, it's in formation of sisters and brothers, but also at the parish level. And one challenge right now is that because it's not exactly finalized, the church is not finished this process. So it'll take some more time to determine the kind of formation that'll be essential for all of this. It's a little bit like if we had the idea about building a boat, we need what formation is required to build a boat. So in a way, we have to make the first steps of being training and formation.
So just to repeat a little bit of what I said in English, I think formation around synodality is absolutely critical, and it will come. The challenge in the short term is that until the Synod of Synodality concludes, it'll be difficult to know for sure all of what sits inside of that document, and it will take some kind of an ultimate publication or a series of publications that will then determine the training that comes out of this. Now, looking at just sort of analogously, some years ago, there was an encyclical published called Laudato Si on the environment. And what came out subsequently to that, and it still exists, is an organization, a part of the Catholic Church, that publishes stuff regularly, offers training, videos, PowerPoints, things for local discussions, specifically around ecology and the environment. And I suspect it will be, and that document came out 9 years ago, I believe. So I suspect with synodality, it'll be the same thing. It will take some time, but the church itself will also be providing that. And then that will inform as well how to prepare parishes, and specifically the priests and religious and lay pastoral assistants that work in those parishes. Thank you for the question. And I hope the French was okay. Je m'excuse,
I think it was very good. So now we go with a live question. Someone from the audience. Ronald, if you're ready to ask your question, you can now.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui, Ronald
Can
Dielman.
you hear me?
Oui, parfait.
Hiya, Curtis. What I heard up to now is very interesting. I'm very happy. I think it's good news to hear that about the synod. But I'm also hearing there's a lot of listening and dialogue. On the other hand, when I think of the marginal groups, they're not exactly in the parishes. I'm wondering to what extent we can hope that we can include them in the dialogue and the listening, the people who are on the margins, and even in the action. So that's my concern. Will they be included? Very good question. I would say that we can ask the question, what is the reality of synodality in Ukraine or in Haiti today? There's civil conflicts in both places. And so to go into parish, and as you say, there would be believers or outside. Now, how will the dialogue include them? The answer, first of all, is that dialogue cannot be excluded. That's the main thing of the dialogue, always continues. And for example, in the 3rd century and the 5th century, one of the major challenges and concerns of the population at that time, Christians and up to those days, is Christ a man or God? God and man, a version of God, or an expression of God. I mean, it doesn't mean much for us, but in those days, that was really essential for the Mediterranean people. Even after when an answer was given, a clear answer was given during the 3rd century, it continued for another 200 years. But even if tomorrow Pope tells us, okay, here we are, this is the opinion to hold, it'll keep on changing. We think God is living. God is a living God. It's not. We're not working with a dead God. A God is living, and so newness can occur constantly. Because we are living, we work with a living God. That always change. It changes as things go forth. I don't know if this answers. Je peux le répéter en anglais. I like the idea that it continues. Then we're opening a door. Once the door is open, it'll continue to discuss. It'll continue to manage ideas, and because the spirit is working in that context, I think that's an answer that touches me also. Yes, that's what's important. It's a question of participation in authority. But as I said, in the church, we have to see how the church can help in the civil reality also. What is the role of this church in dialogue with another country that's attacking the Ukrainians? And even once that's over with, if there is a resolution, there'll be other questions that'll come up. So maybe it's a change in another date or time where there will be a council, or we'll need to we'll live with the result, or maybe even we'll change 5 or 10 years later. Who knows? I like the idea that in Ontario, there's a statue of St. Ignatius. It's a little bit in the wind. He's always on the road in a pilgrim, and that's where theology is there at. That's always in movement. Same thing with synodality. It's always in movement. It's not something that we do and then stop or then rub our hands. It's always in movement.
Thank you, Curtis. That's very helpful.
Thank you.
Now we'll return to the Q&A button. And I'm going to try to do my best to read this question out loud because it's a little unclear, but it's along the same lines. You stated that communication does not take place because we tell somebody something. With reference to the LGBTQIA community, in the majority of situations, perhaps the majority of situations, any communication is still prefaced by statements such as love the sinner, hate the sin. We, the LGBTQIA community, is to a great extent still excluded going into the synod. What might be done to facilitate meaningful dialogue in this situation with groups that are still excluded from the discussions?
Yeah, it's not just a fantastic question. It's a unfortunate question, because the main hope for synodality is that nobody is excluded from the discussion. There's Pope Francis has talked about this in sort of two ways: going to the margins and going to the peripheries. And I want to just explain the difference, and then I'll get to your question, but I think this will be helpful. When the Pope says going to the margins, he's referring to people who've been marginalized, and LGBTQIA falls into that category very, very unfortunately. In fact, to call it a category is unfortunate. But when he says go to the peripheries, what he means is to go to the limits of the assumptions that we hold. So I can say in the case of Curtis that I have some views or perspectives about the world, and in some cases those might be fine. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but in other cases they are personal judgments. And what he is asking of us is to go to that periphery, to that place where I've come to some personal conclusion, and ask why it's there. And one of the things the Pope says about that is you can begin that exercise tonight or tomorrow, but at some point, for things to change, it's going to have to begin. Now, he's drawing on a Jesuit tradition of called an examinations of conscience. What is it that's going on in my life that's either leading me towards God or away from God? Or to say that differently, that's leading me towards healthy life with other people or leading me away from a healthy life with other people. So what the Pope would say about your question is that part of the challenge that's being put to all of us in synodality is to go not to LGBTQIA as a marginalized group, because that then separates, that's us and them. but rather to go to the peripheries, which is to ask the question, why is it, or to say this more positively, what does it take so that we can be in communication and dialogue, not as two different things, but as one thing, as people? And then how do we relate to each other? How do we listen to each other? How do we, as I put in my article, notice the bumps that each of us have and respond to that? And that then is church. You know, there's no great example in the gospel of Jesus saying to somebody, because of your choice, you're condemned. It never happens. And that's the hope for the church, is that all people are welcome. I would like to believe that, and I'm often saddened when I hear otherwise, but that's the real hope for synodality. It's also a personal journey to the peripheries, not merely an organizational journey to the margins. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. Thank you, Curtis. And there's a bit of a follow-up from someone else, but I think you've already kind of answered. How would minorities feel? Because you talked about one voice not overtaking or being louder than the other. But if in a group you have one voice that's minority, how does this work so that that sense of being healthy with others takes place, of flourishing?
Well, the single biggest gift in a more or less global organization, one of the few global organizations, let's say outside of the United Nations, is the church. And that diversity comes in simply by being in so many places around the world. Now, I understand that in local contexts that can change quite a bit, and it's more challenging to bring forward perspectives that might be in the minority, or somebody comes from a group that's historically been marginalized, and it's difficult to find voice. But I think the antidote, if you will, or one of the things that helps to prevent that from becoming a kind of evil that permeates everywhere, is the fact that the church is global. And so in the meetings that they are having in Rome and elsewhere around this, there is participation from so many countries. And we simply look at, for example, who the Pope is naming as new bishops, and particularly new cardinals. It's often people from places that previously had never had a cardinal or a senior archbishop. There's been more voice from underrepresented communities now than there probably has been since the early centuries of Christianity. And so I think this is just going to continue to go in that direction. And I can speak in my own case, in my own Jesuit formation. We don't have a formative notion of, well, don't forget the poor. We live with them and choose poverty ourselves as a vow on purpose, so that we ourselves are part of a community that can be marginalized, as opposed to trying to be separated from it. And I think that when we live together, we can work together, and we talk together, and we communicate, and we dialogue, and then we have this synodos, this idea of we are on the same path, and we're going on that path together.
There might be also an element of the compassion that is encouraged in this type of dialogical model, that even if I'm not in your shoes, I can still feel, and that creates a certain energy, even for minorities who might feel excluded and less represented.
Yeah, the empathy is a very important thing, but I do want to stress that, again, I can speak in my own case. I went and lived in Haiti as a Jesuit with the local Jesuits there, not other Jesuits from Canada, the United States, but Haitian Jesuits in the poorest and most difficult part of the country for months, without living on rice and beans and no electricity and all sorts of difficult things. And it honestly was one of the best times of my life. The people were amazing. They really were. Similarly, I've lived in Ukraine, and that is a very, very difficult environment to be in. And similarly, people have been challenged by food, healthcare, electricity, and yet they're right on the edge of Europe. They've got access to technology, but it isn't always been available to them. And there's something about getting completely immersed in that experience for months and months and months and months on end, not sort of what's called, poverty tourism, but in fact, you go and live with somebody else. And then suddenly I can't think of anything but other people. And I think that's also a challenge for us in synodality. When the Pope talks about the peripheries, it's also giving space for us to go and live with people. And I'm not saying you have to move to Haiti or Ukraine like I did, but in our local communities, to be in relationship with the people who are beside us. This is sort of the idea of love your neighbor as yourself. Who is your neighbor? Well, it's the person right beside you. And that is part of synodality, is to notice that neighbor, to speak with that neighbor, and most importantly, to listen to that neighbor with a great deal of empathy.
We've reached the top of the hour, but if you have more time, Curtis, and people are okay with it, we can maybe do a couple more questions.
Sure, I'm happy to take two more questions, and then I'm committed somewhere else after this myself for ministry, so I'll sign off. But this has been great. Thank you. Happy to take a couple more questions.
Okay, perfect. So we got a couple in the who have raised their hands. So Pauline, if you're ready to ask your question, feel free. Pauline,
so are you there,
est-ce que vous êtes là? C'est votre tour de poser une question.
Your question.
Okay, we move on to someone else until Pauline is there. Marie or Mary, you can ask your question. Mary Thompson. Okay, so we go ahead with a question from our list, from the Q&A button. Maybe the diversity that you are talking about, Curtis, will create a mosaic, an unexpected mosaic, which will adapt to today's reality, even if that will take some time, a long time.
Yeah, I think it's clear that. Let me try that a little bit differently. As the discussions evolve on synodality, those discussions, not just in Rome with the Pope, but also in other places at local conferences, gatherings, parishes, town halls, moments like this evening, that's already starting to color the mosaic in some sense. In other words, there's an image or an icon of life that we might say God has already drawn, and part of what synodality is doing is adding some color to it, and that will bring a lot of clarity to what we can hope to see. But I think it's as I alluded to earlier, it's an ongoing mosaic. It's not something that we will do and we'll finish, and then we can say there it is, and that's how we know that it's there. But there will be intervals along the way that will help us and will continue.
Well, thank you, Curtis. I believe that was the last question for the night. Thank you for this very insightful and enlightening presentation, the Q&A period too, Curtis, and for making the time to do this. Thank you to our translators, Albert and Michel, for ensuring that everything went well. And Curtis, if you have any final words before we end tonight's session?
No, I two thoughts. First, I mean, other than thanking you for taking this time to be with us this evening, I'd say thank you for being very interested in synodality and what that might mean for our church for the next millennium, and how that can help us to communicate and be in dialogue with each other, and the fact that these sorts of things are taking place, I think is very, very positive. And so thank you so much for that. And I wish you all the best in your own journey with synodality.
And before we finish, I would like to remind you all that the recording of the session will be sent to you by 72 hours after today. We also hope that you can join us at our next sessions. You can find them via the event link on jesuits.ca. I've also posted it in the chat, or jesuit.ca en français. Again, the link is in the chat, and we'll be also sending them in the follow-up email along with the recording, so you can be aware of what's coming up. And finally, please don't forget to fill out the brief poll that will pop on your screen right after you end the session, or we end the session. It will also be in the email that Zoom will send in a few minutes. Thank you again. Thank you, Curtis, and thank you, everyone.